Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be beginning the muscles, specifically superficial muscles of the shoulder. And we're going to begin with deltoid, which is on page 67 in your textbook. Now, before we get into the muscle itself, I want to review origin and insertion. Origin refers to the point of attachment that is the least movable. And what that means is that point of attachment, all of the action occurs around that particular point of attachment. The insertion is the most movable point of attachment, which means that that's the point of attachment that's actually going to be moving towards the origin. So when we talk about the deltoid, its origin is here and its insertion is right here. So the action goes like this. You see how the insertion moves towards or closer to the origin. Now, knowing the origin and the insertion can help you determine what the actions of the muscle are going to be, because if you think about muscle tissue like a rubber band, it is contractile. It stretches and it contracts. So if a rubber band is placed here, it's kind of pinned in right here, and then it's stretched to here, what happens when that rubber band snaps back? Well, you get whoop, whoop, just like that. So we're going to be using origin and insertion to determine the actions and also to help us understand the actions a little bit better. So let's get into deltoid. Start with a screen share and we'll go right to your book. And here it is. So the deltoid is your shoulder cap muscle, and your book describes it like a triangular shape. And it is if you're looking at it in 2D. However, it has all these lovely fibers. You see how they intertwine with one another. Who remembers what type of muscle this is based on the fibers that are there? That's right, it is a multipennate muscle. Multipennate, see all those lovely fibers intertwine with one another? It's a multipennate muscle, good. And the deltoid actually has 3 different parts. We have anterior fibers, which are located right here. So in front on the anterior. We have middle fibers, which are located right here, straight down the center on the humerus. And then we have posterior fibers, which are back here. They're on the posterior of the shoulder. They all come to a point right here on the humerus. So let's talk about the origin and the insertion of deltoid. Okay, so in your book, you have an O and you have an I, and that means origin and insertion. I'm sure you could have figured that out on your own, but I'll just point it out. Okay, so the origin of deltoid is all of this right here, indicated with a black line, and then the insertion is this splotch right here, indicated in red. These are the origin and the insertion, and honestly, you just have to memorize them the way that they are, okay? So the origin is the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle, the acromion, and the spine of the scapula. So you do have to memorize it in those words. However, it might be easier to make flashcards with origins on them, or origins on one side, insertions on the back, or it might be helpful to print out a blank skeleton and draw in the origin and the insertion. Or it might be helpful to use your visible body program, or it might be helpful to write it out, physically write it out in chart form. I've provided a chart for you at the end of your checklist. It's actually in the module, and it says muscle chart, superficial muscles of the shoulder. So there are a lot of different ways to use this information to learn it, but ultimately you have to memorize it. Okay, so we have lateral 1/3 of the clavicle, acromion, and spine of the scapula as the origin. And the insertion is the deltoid tuberosity. Now that is super easy because it has its own insertion, the deltoid tuberosity. And if you remember, here's my humerus, the deltoid tuberosity was this roughened area right here, has its own little spot of attachment right there. See a little rough spot right there. That's the deltoid tuberosity. So let's take a look at, there we go. Let's take a look at these landmarks on a skeleton. Now this is your visible body courseware, and I've already loaded it up, of course. You might have the apps on your device already, and if you don't, get it soon. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take anterior deltoid and I'm going to fade it. Then I'm going to take middle deltoid and I'm going to fade it. So yeah, I can do this and I can spin them around wovenly. And then I'm going to take posterior deltoid and fade it. Okay, because what I really want to see is the bone underneath. So here we have the clavicle right there. And this part right here is the lateral third of the clavicle, or roughly half, but your book says lateral third, so that's what we're going with. See, right, there's the attachment right there. If we spin them around a tiny bit, you can see the acromion right there, and you can see right where the deltoid attaches to that. And if we spin him back around a little bit further, here's sort of the back half of the acromion process. Remember the acromial angle right here. And then we have the spine of the scapula right there. I'm going to take trapezius and I'm going to fade that as well so we can see the whole scapula underneath, just to get an idea of where this muscle is located on the body. Okay. So I'm going to put these back on here. Show. Awesome. Here it is. All right, so that's anterior deltoid, right? Those fibers, this one, middle deltoid, and on the back we have posterior deltoid. So all we have are the deltoids on here, right? Okay, and you can see the insertion right there, the deltoid tuberosity. It doesn't really show up on the skeleton, of course. It doesn't really matter. You know that that's the deltoid tuberosity now. Okay, so let's go to the actions, right? We're going to use the origin and the insertion to determine the actions here. So the whole of deltoid has an action. So we have all fibers right here. That means anterior, middle, and posterior. All fibers abduct the shoulder. So if we're talking about these being like rubber bands, this spot right here going towards the origin, right? We've got the insertion moving towards the origin, like that. It helps if you make sound effects, okay? That's abduction of the shoulder, abduction of the shoulder. Remember, to abduct is to move away from the midline if you're talking about a limb. Abduct the shoulder, okay? That's all the fibers. Now, since we have different fibers of deltoid, we have different actions. The anterior fibers, right here, are the ones that are located right about here, right? Anterior fibers do anterior kind of action. So anything that's on the front of the body typically will flex or medially rotate, right? So this is no exception. Anterior deltoid flexes, medially rotates, and horizontally adducts the shoulder. Remember, to adduct is to move closer to the midline, to bring a limb closer to the midline. So we have adduction in a horizontal plane. So again, we have flexion, medial rotation, horizontal adduction. Let's look at these. Okay. Oops. So anterior deltoid, we're just going to spin this around right here. I actually have to go back into anterior deltoid. If you can see, it's right up here, and then it'll show you the actions. So flexion, horizontal adduction, and medial rotation are the ones that we're going to look at. Now, abduction is for all the fibers, so you know what that looks like as well. So let's look at horizontal adduction. Let's see the muscle moving. There it is. And I'm going to fade pec major because I just want to focus on anterior deltoid. So here it comes in. It's contracting, so it's pulling the humerus towards the clavicle. Horizontal adduction. Good. Let's take a look at medial rotation as far as deltoid is concerned. And again, I'm going to fade pecs here. And I'm actually going to make them a little smaller because I want you to see that the elbow is flexed, bringing the arm across in the front. I had shown you that because, remember, I said it's a little bit easier to see medial rotation if you have your elbow flexed, even though the elbow has nothing to do with medial rotation. So they're showing you that here too. Let's make them a little smaller. Okay, so right about here, that's medial rotation. Okay, rotating the shoulder towards the midline, medial rotation. Awesome. There we go. Okay, now anterior deltoid fibers do anterior things. Posterior deltoid fibers are on the opposite side. So they are going to do posterior things, and posterior things include extension, lateral rotation, and horizontal abduction. So now we're going away from the midline on the horizontal plane, horizontal abduction. So deltoid anterior and posterior fibers are antagonists to one another, which means they do opposite actions. So this is a muscle that is an antagonist to itself. So it's kind of unique in that way. So we have, for the posterior fibers, extension, lateral rotation, and horizontal abduction. Extension, lateral rotation, and horizontal abduction. And if we go back into here, we can take a look at what those look like as well. So again, we have to go to the posterior deltoid. And so we have horizontal abduction. You can see it's moving away from the midline towards the back of the body. And I'll spin them around here so you can see the actual posterior deltoid here, which is this one. This one right here. You can see it contracting right about in here. Goes all the way back. Okay. And we have lateral rotation of the shoulder as well. And I'm going to fade some of these because I want you to see the whole scapula here. There you go. I'm going to fade that little guy. There we are. So here's posterior deltoid in lateral rotation. There you go. So visible body is great for seeing the muscle as a whole perform the action. Now, as the visible body guy is doing his thing, I encourage you to do the same thing so that you can feel posterior deltoid contract. If you put your hand on that muscle, as you go into lateral rotation, you should feel the muscle tighten up. And you do. Okay, so start making the connection between what's on the screen and what's in your body. And of course, we'll be palpating in class a lot, so we'll have plenty of time to do that. All right, so to recap, deltoid origin is the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle, the acromion, and the spine of the scapula. The insertion is the deltoid tuberosity. And the actions of deltoid as a whole are abduction of the shoulder. The anterior fibers only produce flexion, medial rotation, and horizontal adduction of the shoulder. And the posterior fibers only produce extension, lateral rotation, and horizontal abduction of the shoulder. Okay? All right, you have all the info for deltoid. Next up, trapezius.